Thanks to viewer Brandon G. Ha for suggesting a video about the election of 1872. In that 1872 election, one of the presidential candidates died after the election, but before the Electoral College voted. So, who did those electors vote for? And what would happen in a similar situation today? I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. The election of 1872 was a matchup between incumbent Republican President Ulysses S. Grant, who was seeking a second term, and Horace Greeley, one of the most influential, principled, and well-respected newspaper editors in American history. In 1841, Greeley founded the New-York Tribune, which would print everything from European news as reported by Karl Marx to personal editorials denouncing slavery and supporting women's suffrage. He also supported workers' rights, opposed capital punishment, and promoted the temperance movement and vegetarianism. And sometimes, like when he opposed Abraham Lincoln's 1864 re-election, he would receive backlash for his outspokenness. Greeley was a devoted member of the Whig Party, but he was open to supporting new parties that more closely aligned with his values. When the Whigs failed to oppose slavery as strongly as he did, he backed another new party, the rising Republicans. After Grant's first corrupt, scandal-ridden presidential term, Greeley again bailed on his party for the newly established Liberal Republican Party, who drafted him to be their presidential candidate to challenge Grant in 1872. That year, the Democratic Party could not agree on a candidate of their own, but wanted to make sure Grant was not reelected. They figured that their best chance was to back Greeley and the Liberal Republican platform. Earning the nomination was easy for Greeley, but the campaign was much more difficult. Greeley had advocated for the pardon of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, which led Northerners to charge Greeley with being soft on the South. Building upon these allegations, political cartoonists like Grant supporter Thomas Nast depicted Greeley as a self-serving philosopher willing to do anything to beat Grant, including forging alliances with groups like the Ku Klux Klan. In all, Nast drew about 80 cartoons that skewered Greeley. Later, Grant acknowledged that Nast's cartoons played a significant role in his victory. Greeley wrote to a friend, "I've been assailed so bitterly that I hardly knew whether I was running for the presidency or the penitentiary. Well, I am used up." It is no surprise that Greeley was used up. In the month of September alone, he delivered nearly 200 speeches across 5 different states. Although Greeley won a respectable 2.8 million votes to Grant's 3.6 million, he was projected to only win 66 electoral votes, 220 fewer than Grant. But the election loss was not the only thing that used him up. Over the previous 20 years, Greeley's wife Mary had suffered from consumptive lung disease, known today as tuberculosis. Her condition worsened in the month before the election. On October 12th, Greeley effectively stopped campaigning to be at her bedside. On October 30th, 1 week before the election, Mary Greeley passed away. Horace Greeley was devastated. After the election, Greeley returned to the New York Tribune to resume his editorial duties, but he lacked his usual spark and was having trouble sleeping. Then he learned there was a movement to remove him as editor, essentially removing from his life the last thing that mattered to him. On November 13th, having been removed as editor, Greeley wrote of his hopelessness. "Having done wrong to millions while intending only good to hundreds, I pray God that he may quickly take me from a world where all I have done seemed to have turned to evil, and wherein each hour has long been and henceforth must be one of agony, remorse, and shame." 61-year-old Greeley was in both physical and mental decline. On November 19th, Greeley's family doctor admitted him to a Tarrytown, New York sanitarium run by Dr. George Giote for nervous prostration, basically nervous exhaustion. Apparently, it was not his first. Greeley could no longer recognize the names of his friends, and he kept repeating the nonsense phrase, "Now, mind, when I was born I died, and when I died I was born." Greeley was described by his doctors as a raving maniac, which led to him taking medications that the doctors of the time did not completely understand. Greeley stopped eating, which led to decreased strength. As he grew weaker, he also became more quiet, until he finally sank into unconsciousness. Greeley's former paper, the New York Tribune, kept their readers apprised of Greeley's condition. On November 27th, the Tribune assured its readers that Greeley was still suffering from nervous prostration arising from almost total loss of sleep for a month or more, as well as a lack of appetite, but he was improving. Unfortunately, Greeley was not improving. In the early evening of November 29th, 5 days before the Electoral College was scheduled to cast their votes, Horace Greeley died. Since no autopsy was performed, the cause of his death is unknown. It may have been the medication, or malnutrition, or a broken heart. Either way, this was the sad last chapter for the man newspapers hailed as the greatest editor America has produced, the most remarkable man in the United States, the foremost man of his time, and the apostle of freedom. From a political perspective, Greeley's death did not impact the outcome of the 1872 election, but it did leave a question for his 66 Electoral College supporters. What do I do with my vote? At the federal level, there were no legal, required, or sanctioned processes to follow if a candidate died after an election but before the vote of the Electoral College. So on December 4th, when the Electoral College voters in each state met, most voted for someone still alive. 42 voted for Thomas Hendricks, a Democrat who had just won election as governor of Indiana. His national popularity was on the rise. Eventually, he would serve as vice president under Grover Cleveland. 18 voted for Benjamin Gratz Brown, Greeley's vice presidential running mate and the then governor of Missouri. 2 Georgia electors cast their ballots for their popular former Democratic governor, Charles Jenkins. And there was 1 vote for Associate Supreme Court Justice David Davis, who had run against Greeley for the liberal Republican nomination. This accounted for 63 of the 66 electors pledged to Greeley. The other 3, they still voted for Greeley, even though a House of Representatives resolution had already stated that votes for a deceased person would not be officially counted. So now, a precedent has been set, sort of. 152 years later, the process is not much clearer. There are multiple stages in the election process, and at each step of the way, a candidate may die or become incapacitated. If something happens to the candidate after the nominating convention, but before the election, the candidate's party is responsible for picking a replacement, which can be the vice presidential candidate, but it doesn't have to be. Both the Republican and Democratic parties have rules for how their party will fill the vacancy. That replacement's name is then added to the general election ballot. After the general election, a candidate's death or incapacity becomes more complicated. If the candidate dies after the popular vote, but before the Electoral College vote, which is what happened to Greeley in 1872, the parties followed the same process as before. They pick a candidate for the vacancy that they hope the Electoral College members will vote into office. The political implications are higher when the candidate has won the popular vote. Essentially, the vote is taken away from the general voting public, since they do not get to vote again. It goes straight from the party to the Electoral College voters. However, there is no federal law that the Electoral College voters must vote for their party's selected candidate. They can vote for whomever they wish, as long as they abide by the state laws within their respective states. Section 3 of the 20th Amendment to the Constitution does clarify what happens when the president-elect dies before the inauguration. The rules of succession apply, and the vice president-elect becomes president-elect. Just one small problem. There is no definition for when a winning candidate becomes president-elect. Is it after the Electoral College votes in December? Or is it after those votes are certified by Congress in early January? Luckily, we have not yet had to find out, as I'm sure it would include challenges, and the 12th Amendment, and a vote by the House of Representatives, all or any of which would create a lot of protests. As for Greeley, he's not really remembered today. He hoped his newspaper would live long after him, which it did for another 52 years, until in 1924 it was merged into the New York Tribune, which continued on until 1966. Despite the legacy of his newspaper, Greeley had no illusions about his own immortality. Fame is a vapor, popularity an accident. Riches take wings, he once wrote. The only earthly certainty is oblivion. Thanks for watching.